Alright, let's go ahead and go over our bell work. Which goal of psychology answers the question, what's going on here? What would that be? Ms. Marissa? It's the descriptive goal. Okay. Remember we talked about subliminal messages? Maybe in a bit I can find that subliminal commercial that I was referencing yesterday. Number 2, which goal of psychology can be seen in the marshmallow experiment video that we watched yesterday? What would that be? Ms. Orrs? Yeah, prediction. They can predict, how successful these young people are going to be years on down the road, based off of their ability to delay gratification and demonstrate self-discipline. Okay. Number 3, which goal of psychology is most closely tied to applied research? I don't think we got that far in our notes yesterday in this particular class. Is that correct? Okay, so there's 2 types of research. I'll show you the notes to you here in a moment. There's basic research and applied research. And usually the way that I differentiate those two is I think about Alzheimer's. Now, it could apply to many different things. I just randomly chose Alzheimer's as content here, okay? If I'm doing basic research with Alzheimer's, I'm just trying to figure out as much as I possibly can about the disease in and of itself. Sound good? I'm not trying to really do anything with Alzheimer's. I'm just trying to figure it out, okay? That's basic research. Applied research is where I'm trying to take that knowledge of Alzheimer's and I'm trying to do something with it to improve people's lives, right? To make people's lives better. That's the influence goal of psychology as well as, applied research. Sound good? So I kind of want to answer the question. So the answer here would be the influence goal of psychology. Sound good? Number 4, which goal of psychology most commonly answers the why question? Ms. Brooke? That would be explanation, right? The explanation goal, okay? All right, let's go back to our notes and finish those up from yesterday, and then we'll move on to what we're looking at today, okay? We were on the influence goal, right? Yes? We got prediction already? Right? Okay. So, again, this particular goal of psychology is the one that I like the most. It's probably the reason why I got interested in psychology in the first place. It's for my personal experiences, how can I make my life better? Right? Or how can I influence the lives of others around me? And as an educator, psychology works out really well in things about behavior modification and things like that. Okay? I had a student, it's probably been 8-10 years ago. It was really the first week of class, kind of like where we're at right now. Maybe it's even the first day or so. And he asked the question, when do we get to talk about mind control? That's why I'm here. I want to learn about mind control. And I was like, I don't know if we're going to really talk about mind control. But, we do talk about influencing people's behavior around us, So there's some aspects of psychology where you can, I wouldn't say control people's minds, but you can affect their behavior. Sound good? If you really understand it. And so that would be, again, with the influence goal there. Remember yesterday we talked about driving, skills of driving and stuff between males and females, and young people versus old people. And this guy, he's going through his driving training program, kind of like the idea of influence, goal of psychology. All right, so you get the 4 goals. Now we have 2 types of research. Like I said before, thinking about Alzheimer's, you have basic research, trying to get as much knowledge about that particular subject area as possible. And then you have applied research where I'm trying to take that knowledge and I'm trying to apply it to subjects to make their lives better. And one of my favorite aspects of psychology is sports psychology, and a lot of sports psychology is focused on applied research rather than basic research. Right? How can we take our ability levels to the next level by focusing on or applying aspects of psychological research? Okay? And like our critical thinking squares, a couple points on how to think like a scientist. So I said there's some characteristics associated with critical thinking. I think there may be a test question is phrased something like, how do you think like a scientist? And you have to say, I have to use my critical thinking skills, okay? But these characteristics include independent thinking, and sometimes we have a difficult time doing that. You know, we have a tendency to conform to the thoughts of those around us. But if you think like a scientist, sometimes you have to cut yourself off from those previously accepted thoughts, and you have to challenge yourself to think a little bit differently. Suspension of judgment, and then willing to modify past judgments as well. Okay. Again, there's a lot of times in psychological research where you have something that's established in the subject area of psychology, and everybody's saying, yeah, that's a given, and then later on you get somebody that starts using their critical thinking skills and they approach it from a different perspective, and they think, man, maybe that wasn't such a given, right? And then they go away from it. Okay? I think of Freud, you know, very popular figure in psychology, dominated, you know, psychological thought for a long time, but today, you know, his psychodynamic theory is not the most popular theory anymore. It's definitely gone by the wayside just a little bit. Okay? Right, I think that is it for our notes from yesterday to finish those up. We need to transition today to our descriptive research methods. Okay? So we're going to get 4 descriptive research methods today. And these all would fit underneath the description goal of psychology. Sound good? And with each of these research methods, I'm going to try to give you some examples to think about how they could be applied to analyzing human behavior. But in addition to that, on Monday, when you guys come in, your bell work assignment is going to be something like this outline, where I'm going to ask you list the 4 descriptive research methods, right? And then I'm going to ask you to identify 2 advantages and 2 disadvantages for each one. Sound good? So as you go through your notes, you know, be thinking about those 2 advantages, 2 disadvantages. Sound good? Be looking for those. All right. First off, an opening question. What's the simplest form of research? Simplest form of research. It's easy. Everybody does it. It is simply, it begins with an O. It's observation. Right? The simplest form of research is just, it's observation, observing what is going on around you. Mr. Glick, you're not familiar with this guy, are you?
Urkel?
Oh, you are.
I'm not that old.
Not that
but
old?
I know who Urkel is.
Okay. He was Steve Urkel, Family Matters, right?
Yeah. I caught it on Nick at Night.
Oh, yeah. It was a good TV show when I was growing up. All right, 4 types of descriptive research methods. Again, 2 of them are observation, naturalistic observation, laboratory observation, case study research, and survey research. So, again, we're going to try to identify 2 positives, 2 negatives, or 2 advantages, 2 disadvantages for each one, and then make some applications, give you something to think about here as well. So the GIF there in the bottom right-hand corner, what would that be of the 4? Naturalistic, laboratory, case study, or survey? It's survey research. Okay? Survey research. I imagine you've been exposed to a few of those, right? Let's start with naturalistic observation. All right? Naturalistic observation is great. One of the advantages is it's free, it's cheap, it's cost effective. Okay? And you can do it just about in any environment. Okay? I just put up a couple suggestions. I put the airport. The reason why I put the airport is because you've got a lot of people from a lot of different places coming in a small area, and so you can observe a wide range of people there, and ages as well. You may be one problem with that in an airport, not necessarily a problem with naturalist observation, but that would be, it would be biased. Why would an airport have some bias what are you not,
Okay.
what are you not including in your sample?
Not everyone can always afford.
Exactly. So it's biased based upon income, your money, right? So you always, when you're looking at research, you have to keep those things in mind, right? How representative is the sample that people are using? Another one that comes to mind, kind of getting off the side a little bit, but football season is starting. You guys heard of CTE before? CTE is the stuff that's associated with like brain trauma and concussions and like deterioration of the brain because of repetitious hits, right? So there was research results came out a couple years ago, and it said something like 99% of professional football players had evidence of CTE, right? 99%. And so everybody's like, that's crazy, that's nuts, right? We shouldn't play football anymore, right? But when you go and dig deeper into who was included in those samples, it was families of football players that had passed on, right? And they had willingly donated the brains of these family members to this particular research because they had anticipated or thought some type of brain disease was going on. Sound good? So they did not open it up to everybody. So essentially they have a biased sample to start off with. Sound good? Alright, so you gotta keep those things in mind whenever you're looking at it. CTE is an issue, right? Brain trauma is an issue. I don't want to say that concussions, those are dangerous. I ran into another psychologist who said that playing football is like the equivalent of doing heroin. So he's like, would you let your kid do heroin? So he had a different perspective on that. Yes?
Are you referring to the Steelers and the work of Dr. Malu?
Yeah, I think so. I don't remember the
Because there
name.
was a movie based off of it.
Yeah.
And all that was
Yeah.
saying CTE.
Have you seen Concussion?
Yeah, I watched it last year and it had.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive. It's some good stuff. If you guys haven't seen it, it's a good one. It really does give you some insights into some psychology in there as well. Okay. All right, back to naturalist observation. So essentially, what it is: recording behavior in a normal setting. Let's get that for right now. Sometimes it's the only way to do research, and that would be exemplified by the image there. So we're looking at natural disasters, right? So if there's like an earthquake going on, you can't really simulate an earthquake, right? You can't set that up in a laboratory or do some other form of research, right? You have to approach that, we're looking at how do people react in a stressful situation of natural disaster, right? You have to do it through naturalist observation, but this also, this image kind of helps you to figure out how you can conduct your naturalist observation. Do you necessarily have to be there in the moment? Or can you use, video, right? Video observations, right, can be a big component aspect of naturalist observation as well, okay? All right, limitations. So first off, we got it's cheap. You can do it just about anywhere. The third advantage is the subjects that you are observing, they are in their natural setting. And what I mean by that, they are in their natural setting, it's obvious they're in their natural setting, but their behavior is not skewed because they're in their natural setting. Sound good? They don't manipulate, they don't modify their behavior because that's their regular routine, okay? The disadvantages, you got observer bias, okay? You may write that down. That's a disadvantage that you're going to see multiple times here. So what Mr. Bowman is seeing in this image may be a little bit different from what I see in this particular image. I'll give you a different example. Say that we're looking at aggressive behavior in preschool children, okay? And so we sit out here by the fence with the preschool over here, and we observe the children while they're playing at recess, right? Now, what I define as aggressive behavior may be a little bit different from the next person, the next observer, what they define as aggressive behavior. Sound good? And so that creates a little bit of a bias there. So you got to be careful with that, with naturalistic observation. Okay. All right, moving on. Laboratory observation. The advantages, you have more control over the variables. That are at play. There's this concept called confounding variables. I'm gonna write that out to the side, and you may want to put it actually under a disadvantage for natural observation. Confounding variables, CONFOUNDING. Okay. What a confounding variable is it's a variable that you don't necessarily take into consideration. Okay. For example, when a researcher does a natural observation, they're going to take into account, like temperature, right? That's something that's obvious. They're going to take into account like the number of people that are in the setting. Okay? But what they can't take into account is a lot of times the subject's previous experiences. And one example of research that comes to mind would be they did a study on alcohol consumption and aggression in individuals. And one thing that they couldn't take into consideration was previous alcohol use prior to the experiment, right? Prior to the study. So previous alcohol consumption, the amount of alcohol that they had consumed prior to that experiment could, skew the research. So that would be considered a confounding variable. Okay? So in a laboratory observation, they can try to eliminate, you can do a pretty good job of eliminating all these extra variables that you wouldn't be able to in a naturalistic setting. You also have more equipment to monitor physiologically what is happening to your subjects as you're observing them. Okay? There's two areas of success that they've had with laboratory observation: sexual responses and sleep as well. Okay? Now, when you think about sleep for a second, if you're sleeping in a laboratory, is it going to be the exact same sleep as you are having if you're at home? No. Okay? So that would be a disadvantage of a laboratory observation, right? Can we take what we learned in a laboratory observation and say that this is applicable to all situations? Because it's really not their natural setting there. So there's some separation. So you guys remember the Bobo doll? That would be Albert Bandura. This would be a good example of a laboratory observation. I just want to show you this. It is about a minute long.
The model funnel the doll with the mallet,
In depth from what we had before.
flung it in the air, kicked it repeatedly. Threw it down and beat it. It was once widely believed that seeing others vent aggression would drain the viewer's aggressive drive. As you can see, exposure to aggressive modeling is hardly cathartic. Exposure to aggressive modeling increased attraction to guns, even though it was never modeled. Guns had less appeal to children who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling. The children also picked up the novel hostile language.
All right. So you can see how Bandura would pick up on the concepts of observational learning there, and how we could learn so much just from that one laboratory experiment or laboratory observation. Again, the disadvantage doesn't reflect real world behavior because you got some separation there. And then the other disadvantage that would, again, differ from naturalist observation, it's going to cost money. You're going to have to pay for a building, you're going to have to pay for the equipment, you're going to have to pay for the staffing. Naturalist observation is free for the most part. Laboratory observation, not so much. Okay? All right, the third one is case study. The case study is where you narrow down your focus and you look at one individual and you follow that individual or that small group of people for a long period of time, for an extended period of time. Okay? And so this could be 5-10 years. This could be 60 years. They started some case studies quite a few years ago, and today they're getting some pretty good results from them because these guys are getting older and older and older, right? And it's wrapping up their studies that way. So there's a couple popular case studies that I want you to think about. Let's start with the one on the right. This guy with the pole that goes up through his head. It's not stationary, but actually went up through his head and exited through his head. His name's Phineas Gage, Phinpeas. Phineas Gage, Gage. This is back in the 1800s. He was a railway construction worker, and his job was to pack the dynamite. He was a very responsible guy. They thought a lot of him, and so they gave him one of the most dangerous jobs. You got the dynamite, and then you take this long iron pole and you pack it, right? Well, one time he was packing the dynamite, hit the iron pole up against a rock, sparks, sets the dynamite off, and the pole shoots, right? And it went up through his skull, and then it exited his brain. Okay, so everybody around him, you assume pole has just gone through your head. They assume he's gonna die, right? So he's still coherent through the whole process, right? So they decide that they take him back to the hotel that they're staying at, and they're staying near. And there's really not a medical facility close to them, so they're essentially just waiting for him to die. And the thing is, he didn't die. They took his skull and pieced it back together, did the best they could there, and gave him his best medical attention that they could, and he didn't die. He survived it, the whole thing, okay? So in the months after the accident, what happened, what they started noticing was a drastic change in personality, though. Okay? Before the accident, he was a well-liked individual, very responsible, hardworking. Okay? After the accident, after he had fully recovered and regained his health, he was unreliable, right? Irresponsible. They couldn't keep him as an employee for the railway construction company. He eventually, it said that he goes and joins the circus thereafter, right? Because of his lack of responsibility. So, what are we implying here? What are we learning from this particular case study? We learned that this is one of the first examples of a connection between the physiological part of your brain and then the outward personality that you have. Sound good? So there's a connection between the two of them. So, pretty impressive case study. All right, the second one, this guy over here is Sigmund Freud. He's the guy that came up with the iceberg theory of the mind, the psychodynamic theory, psychoanalysis, right? Some pretty impressive stuff that really dominated psychology in the first half of the 20th century. His ideas, all of his ideas for his theories actually came from case studies, okay? What he was doing was he would take individuals that would have some severe disorders. You can look these things up and read through these manuscripts about the individuals that he was in some severe cases, some people that had some really strong psychological disorders. And he was learning from them, right? And coming up with this idea of how the mind works. And what he did was he took what he learned from them, from these people with issues, psychological disorders, and he said, it's everybody. We apply this to everybody, okay? So that was probably one problem with his research. He really didn't study normal, healthy people. He always studied people that had psychological disorders, okay? So here's just a review of Phineas Gage.
Back in 1848, there was a pretty ordinary man who had an extraordinary accident. You've probably heard of Phineas Gage, the railroad foreman who had a 1-meter iron rod blasted through his skull. The details are pretty graphic. Think bits of brains and skull going everywhere. This is my friend Anna from Gross Science, who's here to take you through all the gory details.
Part of Gage's job constructing railroads was to sprinkle dynamite into blasting holes.
One afternoon, he tamped the iron rod down into a hole filled with dynamite, and it blasted off into his head. It passed through his left cheek, behind his left eye, through his frontal lobe, and out the top of his head, landing 8 meters away. Medical records suggest he was conscious for the entire time. He went to see a physician who stuck his fingers on either side of the wound to pick out pieces of loose brain and skull. But it wasn't so clear-cut. His brain developed a fungal infection, and his physician had to puncture tissue in Gage's nose to drain the wound.
Okay, another view. Miraculously, Gage survived this massive head injury and he appeared normal. He could still talk, walk, and function as he did before. But those who knew him said Gage was no longer Gage. He was rude and impatient. The rod had penetrated his frontal lobes, responsible for higher mental functions like social behavior and planning. And Gage could have had what we now know as frontal lobe disorder. Although we don't have a lot of evidence about Gage's story. Only a few doctors' reports are published in medical journals. Some say his behavioral changes are grossly exaggerated. But those medical reports did contribute to modern neurology. They supported emerging theories that our cerebral functions were localized and that certain conditions could be linked to brain damage. More recent study in people with brain lesions suggests that the orbital frontal lobe, part of Gage's brain that was damaged, is super important in decision making. And in 2012, researchers reconstructed scans of Gage's 189-year-old skull to show that most damage was to his frontal lobe. But the passage of the rod would have interrupted the connectivity of many different brain areas, making Gage's behavioral changes similar to those suffering from Alzheimer's disease. But brain injuries don't just come from trauma, they can come from diseases too. Check out Gross Science, where Anna explains how the herpes...
Case study of disadvantages. You got observer bias, just like you have in some of the others. With observer bias in this particular case, you want to think about it a little bit different way. You're spending so much time with an individual. Sometimes you're so committed, right? You want to get something out of that research. And so sometimes you'll skew it, or you'll have a little bit of bias in what you see because of the amount of time that you've dedicated to one particular research program. The other thing is, kind of like Freud, is it applicable to other cultures and situations? We looked at one group, can we apply it to everybody else? Okay, look at one person, does this apply to everybody else? Okay. Last one is survey research. One thing you probably want to write down with survey research, it's the most widely used of all research methods, not just the descriptive research method, most widely used of all research methods. It can come in many different forms. You've got face-to-face interviews, you've got phone interviews, you've got other types of questionnaires, you've got hard copy of questionnaires, you've got surveys that pop up on your phones all the time. You know, you download an app, and you're using an app, pops up on there. Surveys are everywhere, right? And the reason why they're so popular is because you can collect some valuable information with them if they're done and completed in a proper way, right? There are some disadvantages though, research, or survey research. Actually, go back to the advantages. Again, they're fairly cheap as well. They're fairly cost effective. It's not that difficult to come up with survey research questions either. So that does create it, make it an advantage. In the world we live in, because of our technology, it makes it easier to distribute the survey research as well. Okay? Disadvantages, researchers cannot survey the entire population, so they have to come up with a sample, and hopefully that sample is representative. If it's a skewed or biased sample, then you're not going to be able to apply the results of that research. Okay? And it's happened multiple times. Okay? It's happened multiple times. There was a report called the Kinsey Report back in the 1940s, 1950s, and it was on sexual behavior in the American male, I think. And what they did was they went to the DMV to get phone numbers for subjects for the research. The DMV is the place where people register their cars. In the 1940s, does everybody have a car? No, only the upper middle class had a car. The people with money had a car. So essentially what they were doing is they were surveying that particular group and not everybody else. right? So the results couldn't be applied to the entirety of the American culture there. Okay? There are also problems with interviews and questions. A lot of times, for a female interviewing a male, the male wants to present himself as, you know, the best he could possibly present because it's a female interviewing him, and so he will skew his answers, right? And vice versa, right? A male interviewing a female, a lot of times researchers found that's an opportunity to get some wrong, biased, skewed research when that happens to be the case, okay? The other thing is, in sociology, we look at this a little bit. Based upon the way the questions are worded, they can be loaded, right? And you can get answers, right, just by the way that you word the question, okay? And that would skew the research there as well. So you got to be very careful with the way that you approach, you know, they call it your instrument, right? Your survey research there, okay? Does anybody have any questions about the 4 descriptive research methods? No? All right. I think we'll be done with our notes today. I want to share with you what we're going to be doing over the course of next week on your own outside of class. Actually, I'll leave this off. It is posted on the website. Over here on the left-hand side. I think it's posted. Yep, down here. All right, second to last one down on the left-hand side. Alright, I want to read through this together. It says, for this assignment, you are to perform, write up, brief naturalist observation, follow the guidelines below. You may work with one partner, okay? And so I'll go ahead and put you in your partners. Choose a person, firm, person behind this account. Williamson, you guys together, 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 you guys together. Alright, chance, maybe with you guys. Sound good? Alright, since he's not here today. Decide what you observe and develop a hypothesis. So some students, this is the first place where they make mistakes. They get so excited and they get started doing it and they forget to do a hypothesis first. First thing you gotta do, create a prediction. What do you think you will see during your observation? For example, hypothesize 6% of women will look into the mirror while only 25% of the men will look into the mirror while passing by. Choose a setting and time for the observation. You are to spend approximately 15 to 20 minutes watching and making a detailed record of the subject or subjects, gathering data, which will begin to test your hypothesis. Plan your observational method to be sure you are not discovered, because if you are observed, then what does that do to the people's behavior? Yeah, it manipulates their behavior. A few years ago, we used to do the naturalist observation where we measure the distance between people. And so students would walk around the school with sticks like this, right? And they'd walk up to people and they would measure the distance between them, and then they'd write down their data, right? And every time they'd walk up to them, what would the students do? They'd start trying to skew it. People started figuring out what we were doing, and so they'd start hugging each other and getting really close to each other, or they'd start getting really far away that way, okay? It was fun. They got creative, and you know, people started doing, this is the friend zone, this is the zone, and this is the enemy zone if you're way out there. That one. But we found that the research was, our results were really, really skewed. Okay. After you finish with your observation, you need to write a typed 12-point double-spaced report of your observation. There's not necessarily a length; it's really in paragraphs. Try to be as objective as possible, but feel free to make well-reasoned inferences about what you have seen. Your report should include the following: hypothesis up front, data in the form of a chart, a paragraph summary of the observation, and a conclusion or analysis of the observation. Okay? Attach your notes to the back of your report and turn your completed observation in. See me if you have any questions and develop an idea. So here's your possible ideas. Observe students leaving school, walking in the mall, or sitting in a restaurant. How many are on their cell phone? How many people driving are on his cell phone at a particular location? This should be illegal now, I think. How many people go through a yellow light? How many people wipe down the gym equipment after they use it? How many people return their shopping carts to the cart area What percentage of people order water rather than soft drinks? Is there a correlation in body size? Remember, you're not to spy on anyone. This is difference. There is a difference. You may only watch people in public places. Do not interfere with anyone or let them know you are watching them. All you do is observe and take notes. It also says you must include a photograph as proof that you completed this assignment. And what students have usually done is they either take a photograph and they put it in a doc and then they print it out and just attach it to the document. I think that's probably the easiest way to do it. Does that sound good? All right. Students to pass is sometimes called the naturalist observation, the creeper assignment, because you're observing people, right? But we're doing it in a way to be research-based, trying to think like scientists. Does anybody have any questions? Again, you are not limited to these ideas. Okay, you can do a number of different things. One that comes to mind is students, they went to the Eureka Park, and you know how when you go up the hill, it's got the speed, the radar, right? And so they were just observing how many people sped, and then they were making correlations between males and females, old people, young people, drivers, those type of things with their observation. So I thought that was a good one. So you can be creative with your choice of observation. One thing that I always encourage is the simple. The simple is usually the best, right? Don't overdo it sometimes. Sometimes we overdo it and then it gets more complicated than what it has to be. All right? I'll let you have the discussion for the last few minutes. And you guys can brainstorm, come up with some ideas there. Sound good? Okay.